Welcome to Guts and Guns.
Today, we're really jumping into a fascinating, sometimes tricky story. California's political and economic evolution. We've got some great sources here, including pieces from California's political and economic shifts, and they paint, well, quite a picture of the Golden State. You know, California has always been seen as this land of opportunity, right? Innovation, freedom. But some of our sources suggest that for certain people, today's California feels, well, like a stark betrayal of that promise. So our mission today is to unpack all this. We'll look at the criticisms, the history behind it, the fiscal stuff that hits your wallet, plus concerns about election integrity and these big demographic shifts happening. Basically, we want to give you a shortcut to getting informed without getting bogged down.
Exactly. And we're exploring a viewpoint here that argues California might have sort of lost its way from its, original principles. This view talks about a shift away from careful spending towards what's called unrestrained spending and this ever-expanding government bureaucracy. What's really interesting is how this connects back to the state's roots, back to policy decisions made, decades ago. We'll look at the arguments, check the data, and try to, connect the dots for you so you can see why these changes are causing such strong reactions and real changes in the state.
Okay, let's start maybe by looking back. California's conservative roots, often kind of summed up by Ronald Reagan. Our sources paint this picture of the Golden State back then as a beacon of American opportunity, individual liberty, can-do spirit, all that. And Reagan's philosophy, economic freedom, smaller government, less regulation, lower taxes, that really clicked with a lot of people. People definitely remember him promising to cut spending, crack down on welfare abuse in his '66 campaign for governor. He even froze state hiring for a bit. That strong message, limited government. That's the ideal many remember. But was his time as governor really that straightforward?
That's a great question. And yeah, this is where it gets really nuanced. His rhetoric, totally clear on limited government. But the actual record, his governorship from 67 to 75, it looks more pragmatic. He actually inherited a pretty substantial budget deficit. And get this, to fix it, he approved what was then the biggest tax increase in any state's history. And it was a progressive tax increase.
That's great from Reagan. That's surprising.
Right.
It seems counterintuitive. Now, he did give some surplus back later, but that first big move, it really clashes with the anti-tax image, shows some practicality, maybe some compromise already.
So yeah, not just a simple story of pushing a purely conservative agenda. What else from his time shows that pragmatic side?
Well, he had to work with a legislature controlled by Democrats, right? So lots of compromise. Like he signed welfare reform in '71. It cut the number of people getting aid, but it also increased benefits for those still eligible, kind of a two-sided coin. And he signed CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act. That's the law modern conservatives often blame for slowing down building projects.
CEQA, yeah. Still a huge deal today.
Exactly. And he even signed the Therapeutic Abortion Act, though he apparently regretted that later. So these aren't actions of someone just steamrolling a conservative agenda. It suggests maybe that the forces pushing towards bigger government were already deeply entrenched, even back then. Okay, so this difference, this gap between the campaign talk and what actually happened as governor, what does that tell us about California now? It kind of suggests that the state's current direction isn't just some new thing, right? It's more of a long-term systemic challenge, maybe something that started way back.
Precisely. I mean, if even Reagan, with his mandate, had to make those kinds of compromises, it implies the underlying structure, the political reality, made it really hard to fully reverse course towards smaller government.
So if those seeds were planted decades ago, let's jump to today. Our sources talk about a taxation straitjacket. What does that mean for people now? They describe this crushing tax burden as maybe the most concrete sign for many that things have gone downhill. California's taxes are known for being high, complex. So for you, living there or thinking about it, what do the numbers actually look like?
Yeah, it's definitely a key factor. California has one of the highest top marginal income tax rates in the U.S., often over 13% for top earners. And that includes a 1% surcharge on income over $1 million, specifically for mental health services. Sales tax, the base is 6%, but add local taxes, and it can hit, almost 11% in some places?
Wow, nearly 11%.
Yeah, and there's an equity issue here, The income tax is progressive, meaning higher earners pay a higher rate. But sales and excise taxes, they're regressive. Lower income folks spend a bigger chunk of their money on basic goods, so they feel those taxes more. So when you put it all together, sales, excise, property taxes Our sources argue the whole system can actually be regressive for people on the lower end of the income scale.
That's a really interesting point about who bears the burden. Now, a big part of this whole tax story goes back to 1978, right? Proposition 13 passed overwhelmingly. The idea was good, maybe. Stop property taxes from skyrocketing. But what did Prop 13 actually do? How's it still shaping things?
Oh, Prop 13 was huge. It basically did two main things. Capped property tax at 1% of the assessed value, and limited how much that assessment could go up each year, just 2% or inflation, whichever was lower. And crucially, the property value only gets reassessed to current market rates when it's sold.
Right, so you get those situations where neighbors pay wildly different taxes.
Exactly. That's the profound inequity the sources mention. A longtime owner might pay taxes based on, say, a 1985 value, while the new buyer next door pays on today's much higher value. It basically discourages people from moving, locks them into their homes, you could say, and that's definitely a factor in the state's housing shortage.
So it didn't just cap taxes, it actually changed how cities fund themselves, and maybe even where power lies.
What? Precisely. That's the big, often missed consequence. Property tax revenue plummeted for cities and counties, so they became much more dependent on other taxes, sales tax, hotel taxes, things that are more regressive. And this created an incentive, maybe unintentionally, to favor commercial development, like shopping centers or hotels, over building needed housing, because that generated more sales tax.
Okay, so that worsens the housing affordability problem too.
Right. And kind of paradoxically, it shifted power up to Sacramento. The state had to step in more to fund schools and local services, making local governments more reliant on the state budget.
Speaking of the budget, our sources mentioned some massive numbers, hundreds of billions for California. What's driving that spending? And what's the story with jobs? Public versus private sector growth.
Yeah, the numbers are huge. For the 2025-26 fiscal year, the total state budget is projected around $321 billion. General fund, about $228 billion. The biggest chunks, health and human services, K-12 education, that's where most of it goes. But a key vulnerability is how much California relies on personal income tax, especially from high earners. That makes the budget really swing with the stock market and the economy.
So boom and bust cycles?
Kind of. They're projecting a small surplus for 25-26 after a couple years of deficits, but that depends on strong wages and stocks holding up. And looking ahead, they actually foresee deficits again, maybe $10 to $20 billion a year through 2028-29, and reserves going down. So it's a tightrope. And then there's the job trend you mentioned. Late 2024, public sector jobs grew by over 138,000. That's a 5.7% jump. That growth was way faster, like 6 times faster than growth in all private industries combined during that same period.
6 times, wow.
Yeah. So while California's economy is massive, its unemployment rate tends to be higher than the U.S. average, and private job growth has been kind of slow. It suggests maybe that government itself has become a major driver of job creation, not just the private sector.
That feels like a pretty big departure from those Reagan-era ideals of smaller government we talked about earlier. So if you're living in California dealing with these costs, or maybe you're thinking of moving out, how do these tax numbers compare to, say, Texas or Florida, places people are going?
Yeah, the comparison is pretty stark. It really highlights why people might leave for financial reasons. California's top income tax rate, over 13%. Compare that to Texas, Florida, Nevada. They have 0 state income tax.
0. That's a big difference right there.
Huge. Then sales tax. California's can reach almost 11%. Texas tops out at 8.25%, Florida at 8.00%, Nevada around 8.38%, generally lower. Property taxes are interesting. California's average rate is actually lower, around 0.71%, but Texas is higher at 1.60%, Florida 0.83%, Nevada 0.50%. But remember, Prop 13, that average rate in California hides huge differences depending on when you bought your house. The actual dollar amount paid on a newly purchased home can be much higher in California due to the sky-high property values. So yeah, these numbers really show the different fiscal environments, and you can see how that would impact someone's decision.
Okay, moving beyond the money side, our sources also touch on something maybe more fundamental. Trust, specifically trust in the election system. There's this perception among some Californians, we're told, about widespread fraud. What are the sources saying about that concern?
Right. For some people, this idea of widespread fraud is a real worry. They feel the system might be vulnerable. Our sources mention that some folks point to databases that track proven instances of election fraud as sort of evidence for their concerns. And this perception, whether it reflects reality or not, definitely affects public confidence.
That is a serious concern. But what do the sources tell us about California's actual election security? Are there measures in place?
Oh, absolutely. The sources go into quite a bit of detail here. California has layers and layers of security protocols. The Secretary of State's office, the SOS, legally certifies all voting systems, and their testing is apparently one of the toughest in the country. They do source code reviews. They have experts try to hack the systems. That's called red team testing, plus lots of functional tests. And a really key thing, paper ballots. California requires them. That gives you a physical record, a voter verifiable trail for every single vote.
A paper trail. Okay.
Yeah.
That seems important.
Very. And counties have to manually recount votes from 1% of precincts to double-check the machine counts. Plus, and this is critical, no part of the voting system is ever connected to the internet. It's air-gapped. Data isn't sent over external networks, which cuts down cyber risks hugely. And there's a formal process to investigate any complaints or allegations.
Okay, so you have all these extensive safeguards, paper ballots, air gapping, audits, testing, and yet the perception, the belief in widespread fraud still exists for some people. What's the impact of that gap between the security measures and public perception?
That persistence is a really big challenge. It shows this disconnect, right, between how the system is designed to work and how some people feel about it. The Secretary of State's office even acknowledges this. They're actively trying to fight misinformation that they say confuses voters and creates distrust. And you look at nonpartisan groups like the Brennan Center for Justice, their research finds actual voter fraud is infinitesimal, tiny, often just clerical errors, not deliberate cheating. But, and this is the key point, if a decent chunk of the population doesn't trust the system is secure, that's a problem in itself, regardless of the protocols.
That makes sense. The perception can be just as damaging as a real flaw. So how is the state trying to bridge that gap, build that confidence back?
Well, they're trying with things like the California Trusted Information Initiative, trying to get accurate info out there. There was even a court case, Election Integrity Project California, Inc v. Lunn. The court basically said the state's rules for observing elections were legally fine, but, court rulings don't always change hearts and minds. The concerns linger for some. So for you, as someone concerned, the state does have clear ways to report issues. You can contact your local DA, the Secretary of State, even the Postal Inspection Service if it involves mail-in ballots. They want those channels to be known and used.
Okay, so we have the fiscal pressures, maybe some trust issues for certain groups. What are the real-world consequences? Like who's staying in California and who's leaving? Our sources talk about the great exodus. Is that really happening?
The numbers suggest something significant is definitely going on. Census Bureau data for 2023 to 2024 shows California had the biggest net loss of people moving to other states. Over 239,000 more people left than came in from other U.S. states.
Wow, nearly 250,000 net loss in a year. Why?
The reasons seem pretty consistent. Research points mainly to the high cost of living. Housing costs and high taxes are the top reasons people cite. And where are they going? Often states like Texas and Arizona places seen as more affordable, lower taxes. Now, the studies say about 2/3 left for those non-political economic reasons. But, interestingly, about a quarter specifically mention political reasons for leaving.
Politics playing a direct role for a chunk of people. And our sources mention something specific about who is leaving, politically speaking,
Right.
Republicans.
Yeah, that's a really striking finding from the Public Policy Institute of California, the PPIC. The outmigration isn't politically neutral, it leans Republican. Between the 2020 and 2024 elections, people who left California were much more likely to be registered Republicans. Like 39% of those leaving were Republicans, even though Republicans only make up about 25% of all registered voters in the state.
So Republicans are overrepresented among those leaving.
Significantly. It's described as a partisan sorting. During that period, almost 5 times as many Republicans moved out as moved in. That rate was much higher than for Democrats or independents. And if you zoom out, think about the bigger picture, this has real effects nationally. As Californians, particularly Republicans, move to other states, it can reinforce the political leanings of those destination states, making red states perhaps even redder. And at the same time, it solidifies California's position as a strongly Democratic state. It contributes to this political balkanization across the country.
So the state is losing residents domestically, but what about people coming from other countries?
Right, that's the other side of the coin. While domestic migration is negative, international migration has bounced back. Estimates suggest around 134,000 immigrants arrived in 2023-24, so that offsets some of the domestic loss. But this mixed domestic residents leaving, international residents arriving is definitely changing the state's overall demographic and political makeup in really complex ways.
Wow. Okay, so wrapping this up, this deep dive has been, really eye-opening. Our sources paint this picture where For many residents, California's perceived decline isn't just talk, it's their lived reality. It's a narrative, at least from this perspective, of a state moving away from limited government, fiscal caution, towards what's described as a state-centric, high-tax, highly regulated model. And that, according to these sources, is fueling this exodus, this disenchantment for some.
Indeed. And the way these sources frame it, it's like California is a cautionary tale for the rest of the nation, showing how even a prosperous state, through policy choices over time, can become a place people feel they need to leave. And the issues we've talked about, spending, taxes, government growth, trust, they aren't just California problems, are they? So it leaves a big question for you to think about. How does any state strike that balance? Balance between social needs, protecting the environment, and things like fiscal responsibility and economic opportunity for individuals, especially when demographics are shifting and people have really different ideas about what the state's core principles should even be. It's complex stuff, and the answers have huge consequences, not just within California, but maybe for your state too, and for the whole country's political landscape. Something to definitely keep thinking about.
We hope you enjoyed this week's episode. Tune in again.